Hello. Good morning or afternoon, whenever you're watching this. Uh, so this is day 36, because I missed yesterday. But what I want to dig into today, um, actually, I want to jump in with, I think, three stories. So I think that'll make what it is that I want to talk about today reasonably clear. So first story. When I was in graduate school, I was working on a master's degree in mathematics. There's this whole it's like some sort of law, I guess, that graduate students have to go through a kind of boot camp, some sort of like process of, okay, you learn how to be a graduate student in your first couple of years. And while I was um, uh, while I was there, after a couple of weeks, there's this one professor, Boris Botvinnik. Is just like this is really like expansive character because it came from Russia to study um, mathematics. This is at the University of Oregon. Gosh, in around 2006-ish, I think it was. Um, and I remember walking down the hallway at the in the basement and finding him walking in the opposite direction. He was one of my professors for one of my classes, so he recognized me. And he turned to me and asked, "Oh, so tell me, how are you doing?" And like it had been a couple of months into the program at this point. And I looked at him and I honestly said, "Well, I think I'm doing okay. I'm really stressed. I feel kind of dumb, like I'm falling behind, and like maybe everybody else is smarter than me. But I understand that's really common, and everyone else feels the same way. So I guess it's okay." And um, Professor Botvinnik turned to me and said, "Oh yes, yes, that is very understandable. You see, when when you are but before you go through your qualifying exams, so the qualifying exams being a test that we were all preparing for that marks the transition from preparatory work to being a PhD student in math. And I was aiming for a PhD in math at the time. So while you are preparing for your qualifying exams, it is very hard. You sweat and you toil and you work to understand. And then you strain as much as you can and you pass the qualifying exams. And then it gets even harder. And then you squeeze out everything you can. You sweat blood and tears. And you work on putting together your dissertation and you defend it. And then when you finally pass, it gets even harder. It just went on like this for like, I don't know, like 5 minutes. And I was just standing there going, okay, alrighty then. Right. So, yeah, there's something that really struck me about that. I'm told that that is sort of classic Russian humor. This guy was an amazing character. Like a couple of different stories about this guy. I really enjoyed him, although I didn't really entirely know how to interact with him. So, so that's one story, one vignette. Yeah, Ronnie. Yeah, I agree. It was pretty amazing. It's like, oh, okay, it gets even harder. So, what I want to highlight from that is the kind of glee that he had about that and was sharing with it. Okay, so second story. This is more like a cluster of stories. When I was in the Bay Area as one of the co-founders for the Center for Applied Rationality, I had a lot of conversation with really brilliant people, mostly centered on how do we keep the world and by proxy the universe from dying. Um, uh, Thanks, Jedu. Jedu says, great impression. Sounds like classic Russian humor meets Zen teacher. Yeah. Yeah, I didn't have the wisdom to really receive it at that time. Yeah, it was a kick, definitely a kick. Okay, so yeah. Uh, yeah, so while I was in the Bay Area, and I would have all these conversations with really brilliant people, and we were all focused on how do we save the world. and the primary focus being on um, the destruction of all human life and probably all life on Earth through the development of artificial intelligence that is smarter than humans in every way, including its ability to do computer science and therefore make itself smarter. So um, there's this weird kind of phenomenon I would encounter a lot where I would be going through a party where a bunch of these people would be together, or be meeting somebody in the office. The office had an open common space, and we'd have a lot of the people in orbit in the community who would land there and do their work, and we'd have conversations. And there'd be a kind of conversation that I'd bump into, a little bit more common at the parties, where uh, there'd be this thing of, hey, did you hear about this, like this new development from like Deep Blue or whatever, or Deep Mind, I guess is what I'm thinking of, where they came up with this new technological intervention, and for the most part, the answer is no, unless somebody else had the same reaction. But they would they would express, yeah, it's like they're like when coming up with this, they're going. It looks like we might be looking at AI manifesting in the next 5 to 10 years. Um, the thing is, like I'm thinking particularly of there's one kind of conversation I'm remembering, um, where I was talking with somebody who was pointing out that he was saying something like, and I'm dredging up a memory from quite some time ago, and from a bunch of them get blurred together, so I may have to make this a little fictionalized to pull together the quotes here. But he was saying something uh, like, hey, so you know this whole problem with trying to make AI? Well, there's like an ethical question about whether it would make AI friendly, make it match what human beings want. There's actually an ethical question of whether that even makes sense to try. Because, I mean, if we try to get it right, then instead of wiping out all life on Earth, we might get it almost right. But the almost will make it horrible. So you end up with something like the YouTube comment maximizer. So, I mean, they're highlighting something in that I think has a logical content to it that I think is important. Um, this has to do with the fact that near misses to like, if you're going to create a god and the god almost really likes you, that might be worse than a god that just wipes all life off of Earth in terms of the subjective experience. Like that's the basic argument. A lot of them try to implode and explode at the same time when I claim that they're trying to build a god machine. I think they just don't like the aesthetic. But anyway, the but the thing that I actually want to point out, rather than the logic, is the energy. It wasn't. I think it might not make sense for us to try. Right? It wasn't something like that. And even there, I would be like, it's a little suspicious. But there's something funny going on there. But it was, hey, I think maybe it doesn't make sense for us to try. Right? This engaging energy. Many people would have a big grin on their face, going, "Yeah, I know this. It'll probably just kill us all," and it isn't that interesting. It gets even harder. Okay, so vignette 2 of 3. For the third one, this will be a little more coherent. So I had a conversation with my family last night because my father encountered something suggesting that for Washington State, where we're based, he and Mom are both going to be eligible to get the vaccines soon. How soon? Not hard to tell. They're the next group in line. It's sort of like um, if like if you're trying to board a plane and you're in group 4 and they just called group 3, you know you're next in some sense. So it's sort of like that. They know that once they open up the next tier, it looks like he and Mom will both be eligible. And so there's this question of, well, should we do this? Now I don't especially want to get into the content of beliefs about the answer to the question. Okay, I'm not interested in that conversation here. To me, the really interesting part is in me. So where that conversation went, I thought it was very good, very sane for the most part. Where we ended up going had to do with modeling a bunch of different scenarios. Probably the two most distinct ones were, one, if you just take the official standard picture, the one that is endorsed across all of our platforms. If you just take that one for granted, that we're in a pandemic, that we've got that we've had to struggle to get this vaccine out, but now the vaccine is getting rolled out. Here, Ronnie says, "Oh man, this is making me smile. I'm excited for you to tie these stories together." Yeah, thanks. Um, so, so like one scenario having to do with official narrative, and of course, the official narrative doesn't call itself the official narrative; it's the truth. They all call themselves the truth. So, in that thread, the things about, well, of course, this makes sense to get the vaccine, and for me, there was this. I'll go into each of these just a little bit, but I don't want to focus on the content. I want to convey something about the energy here. When we were talking about this one, I was highlighting, okay, so in the official narrative, we've got a problem that looks identical to what it looked like 12 months ago, which is that we are already seeing signs of this wave from this mutation that's coming from the UK. We're already, like, at last check, we had over 50 cases in the United States. Those are the ones that were measured, and we're not even trying to measure them very hard. Our testing is still utter crud. So there's this thing about, well, I mean, come on, this means we've got there's already, the exponential growth is already kicked off, and this thing is supposed to be a lot more virulent than the original strain for COVID. So what that means is we're going to see an explosion over the next couple of weeks. Right? Over the next 2 months, we should see something that is on par with what we encountered in the first half year of 2020. So like that's a concern, and that is happening way faster than we're being able to roll out the vaccines. And a lot of people are meaningfully concerned about the vaccines going on mass spoilage because of a bunch of regulatory blockades that are showing up or something. So even within the official narrative granting everything is basically as it seems, it's like, well, you don't just want to get the vaccine, but you want to get the vaccine yesterday because there is a problem coming, and as a civilization, we're not treating it seriously yet. People are freaking out about the UK virus, but we're not treating it like a real emergency. Okay, so ignore the content, notice the energy. Okay, and then looking at an alternative, there's something very funny about in the official narrative about the fact that in order to explain the behavior of the politicians, the regulatory organizations, you have to assume a mind-boggling level of incompetence at every level. Right? Absolutely mind-boggling. Now, mind-boggling incompetence is not unknown. It's not unknown in the government. But there's like the level at which you would have to like the kinds of systematic mistakes everybody would have to be making in order for us to be failing at the vaccine distribution this badly, to be failing at testing, for the FDA to get in the way of trying to roll out the vaccines. We could have gotten the vaccines out months earlier, best as I can tell. Like I have this phrasing I've been saying throughout this whole thing for over the last half year or so, that all information is crap. This is a reminder that we are in a global memetic war, and we are the pawns and soldiers, and in some sense the research labs of this global information war. So whatever we think we know is often going to be a property of the output of that war, not necessarily a matter of what is sane or true. So keeping in mind, all information is crap. all information is propaganda. Just bearing that in mind. That doesn't mean it's false, but it does mean it's bullshit. And of course, I'm overgeneralizing, but part of the issue is that there's no way to really tell what information stream that I can't vet, I can't see all of the steps of. I can't tell what information streams are actually free of madness. Right? So bearing all that in mind, the level of incompetence we're talking about, like the standard narrative basically says, we are dealing with officials who have absolutely no clue what they're doing, have no idea how to function, and we're also supposed to trust them. So the standard narrative, if you actually follow the logic, isn't really very comforting. So that's an issue. And then some of the alternative narratives, like QAnon made this particularly popular, as in well-known, not necessarily well-believed, although certainly QAnon folk will do that. But the idea that, well, maybe there is no virus, maybe there's no pandemic, or maybe the pandemic is entirely, essentially a placebo pandemic. Maybe it's just the flu, but because everybody is worried, this is wearing down immune systems. And that what's actually going on is something like a corporate rebranding of the flu, since the sales on the flu shots may have been going down, and if we can rebrand the flu as a pandemic and maybe even make it required, then selling the vaccines becomes very profitable and much more guaranteed. Furthermore, if because of government incompetence the vaccines spoil instead of getting distributed, these companies can sell the vaccines again. Again, I want you to track the energy. I'm not saying these things are true. All information is crap. What I want to highlight is that for the... Oh, I see there's a question about the energy, or a comment about it. Let's see. So Ronnie says, I think you're making an interesting general point, but the phrase ignore the content, notice the energy triggers me. Like, I know I am biased. I know my emotions influence what arguments I make, but please criticize the arguments you make, not the motivations you think I have for them. I promise I will change my mind if you break the arguments. Yeah. I want to emphasize this is not about criticism. I think your reaction makes a lot of sense, Ronnie. And I also think that the fact that you get triggered here and that there is fear of being criticized for your motivation is one of the artifacts of the cultural glitch that I keep wanting to point at. I think it only makes sense to point at the motivations. I mean, it makes sense to examine the content of the arguments as well, but trying to engineer ourselves to be able to change our minds because we have received a compelling argument and we can see the logic requires alienating ourselves from the cause of our original belief in the first place. It's not directly dialoguing with where the error came from. Whereas if you flip the order, if you focus on where the error comes from, why it is there is a misperception with reality, and you can use the logic to notice, oh, it looks like there's a misperception here, so what's going on? That actually has promise to address things in a kind way that deals with the core. And that way we don't end up with having to constantly battle rationalization. Rationalization shows up when there is a need to come to a particular conclusion. If you prefer all the way down in your guts and bones, all the way through the deepest core of your soul, if you actually prefer truth, then rationalization isn't an issue. So, and then there's nothing to fight. Then it's just a matter of how do I come to perceive things more clearly. So, at least that's my angle. But again, I want to emphasize, I'm not criticizing you on this stuff. The thing about focusing on the energy is exactly about, let me track a hook. I want to highlight a thing here where there's this mechanism that I observe all over the place. And last night, I saw again, this is not the first time, but I saw again this mechanism in myself. So this is where I'm tying these different threads together. I notice in me an excitement about how terrible the situation is. It gets even harder. Right? There's for me this thing of, like, I think it's a little bit easier in the conspiratorial thinking, because there's something about, like in QAnon, they actually go several steps farther, and they assume that there are individuals who are consciously intending to do evil. And I want to grab that example as a cluster just to highlight, because I think that even if that's true, that doesn't answer the question of why those people are, why those people are thinking and operating that way. So to me, it doesn't even answer the question to say that there are villains. I've heard answers to that. I know a few people who buy into the QAnon structures and ideas, so it's interesting to dialogue with them about this. And to be clear, my more stronger stance is all information is crap. So, but you take the villain's perspective, which I think most people who are listening to this probably don't take. So I'm going to use this as something you can see from the outside. It's not just a matter of making meaning of, oh, well, now if there are villains, then we know whom to fight and we know what side to take, and rah. There's something a little juicy that becomes available about the possibility that maybe these villains are about to win. Maybe we can't even do anything about it, but we're going to try and we're going to fight back. There's something devastating about, from this perspective, about, oh no, Trump has been banned from Twitter, and Parler has been is now being actively censored by Google and Apple, and this is terrible. And I think that it is. I do in fact think that there is something terrible going on there, but it's not. But for different reasons, very different reasons. And I also don't. That's its own snake pit. I'm happy to dive into it. Just I want to make my point though. The thing is that there's something sort of engaging, engrossing about, oh, this is terrible, this is awful. It gets even harder. Like there's this, right, the same kind of thing that was making so many of the rationalists and thinkers that I was interacting with in the Bay Area grin or get excited about how we're doomed, or how there's such an infinitesimal probability of being able to make things okay, or how the game theory of the whole global situation means that like all of the pathways that we so far thought were possible aren't. What are we going to do now? So I noticed this same process happening in me when talking with my family about, okay, even in the standard narrative, here is this wave that is coming. There was in me almost an excitement about, we're so fucked. Look at this terrible wave that's coming. And it's not, I want to emphasize, this is not my conscious attitude by default. It's not like I really want anything bad to happen. It's more like, it's more like, what is it that makes a TV show really interesting? Like if all of the people were interacting like adults, like you imagine, what would be like? Okay, so like the whole thing with Game of Thrones. What made the TV show Game of Thrones so interesting, so engaging? Well, a lot of it was this sense of people being dramatic. There's also a lot of gore and a lot of nudity that was also just like primally engaging. But if everybody had a very level-headed and kind basis where they're just trying to get along, not like, oh, we just want to get along slightly, but even with a sense of strength of, no, we have to work out this. Oh, I have my honor to protect. Oh, you have your honor to protect. Cool. How can we work together so that we can protect your honor, but also let me have power? And because I have the strength and I want to maintain this, what do we do? right? Like a lot of the Game of Thrones would not be as engaging if people are just cutting through all of the identity stuff and all of the hookiness. So the entire thing about what's engrossing about it is that it's dramatic, that bad things might happen, and sometimes they do. Um, and just about every TV show I see has this kind of theme to it, of people making assumptions about what one another mean, and then running off and being offended or hurt. Um, uh, yeah, David Swedlow mentioned someone is about to tell the emperor he has no clothes. Hold your breath in horror and glee. Yeah, yeah. So there's this. I want to call it an addiction, and I don't think. And when I say that, I know I'm putting in a little bit of a charge. What I'm trying, my intention behind it, my desire, is not so much to vilify this as to highlight a mechanism. There's a part of me that wants to vilify it, and I want to own that and put that forward, going, yeah, here's a bit of energy in me to digest. But what I'm looking at is in myself. There's this excitement about, oh, this wave of the UK virus is coming. And did you hear? Notice the energy. Did you hear about the South Africa strain, the South Africa mutation, which it looks like our vaccines might not even touch? And like when I described this, my sister went, I don't know if that's true. There's like this scrambling of, yeah, one part of me going, I want to anchor in truth, and the other part going, but maybe it is true. Maybe it is. It's like, okay, what's that about? And then on this other side, this direction of, okay, we're obviously in a global mimetic war. Like that to me seems uncontroversial. Well, I mean, of course it's controversial because we're in a mimetic war. But if you understand how memes work, if you understand what a mimetic war is, and then you look around, it's obvious that there isn't another option. And then the question is, what is the nature of the war? But I think that we are in a global, multipolar, massive, all-out mimetic war, and that what we are seeing is the chaos that comes from all of our common resources getting ripped to shreds in service of this war. Probably the most obvious version of this war that we're aware of is in the United States is the leftist perspective versus Trump supporters. That's just one example. But this thing is really, really massive and widespread. The culture wars. For example, the culture wars are an example. So looking at that and going, well, I think maybe the really big players here, like the ones that really have most of the power, might actually be the corporations. I don't know. All information is crap, but holding on to that possibility. There's then this thing, like I found myself saying things like, I wonder whether they might actually make the vaccines in ways that are intentionally causing people to be sick. And it's like when I pause and I reflect on that, that would be really hard to do and also unnecessary. And I notice that it doesn't fit the logic of, well, then why are there all of these regulatory things that get in the way of the vaccine's distribution? Like it doesn't even fit the conspiracy theory picture, but I found myself leaning into it. So therein lies madness. And I'm noticing in myself this excitement about a particular kind of drama. Maybe things are really bad this way. So the thing that I want to name here, I refer to this as kind of a drama addiction. It's another form of being hooked. It's a very special form of being hooked. It might be a very general form. I'm not quite sure, but it's something that I see all over the place. Just this morning, I was reading through a comment thread where one person, Perry Chase, I've mentioned her a number of times on this on these calls or in these videos, put forward a statement about how she's really concerned about the implications and ramifications. She didn't quite say it that way, but and I may be putting words in her mouth. But basically, she's concerned in seeing that Twitter banned Trump. And she later clarified, this is not about having banned Trump per se. This is about the structure. There's a concern about the structure, and that this is an assault on free speech. And then in the comment threads, there's just all of this back and forth, which to me was mostly just madness. I don't know about mostly, but like, I don't know, somewhere between a third and a half of the comments were, um, uh, like, as judged by my gut, which is not all that great at ratios, but that was my emotional impression. Um, that like a lot of them were either actively like pushing back on no, like freedom of speech means these things, and besides, Trump is bad, and it's like okay, sort of missing the point. And others, um, like that side's a little less clear for me to spell out. But the thing that I want to highlight there is this there's actually a clarity of perception. I don't know if this point's going to convey. I'm going to take a stand of here is a clear fact about the structure of the world, and if this doesn't land, if you're going to disagree, well, that sucks for you. um, uh, the uh, um, the issue at the free speech level is not about Trump being banned. In this point, I think I just completely agree with Perry about this one. Um, the issue is that these resources of Twitter and Facebook and the ability for platforms like Parler to exist requiring Google and Apple's permission means that in effect, tech giants privately rule our public common spaces for conversation. It doesn't matter what the official laws have to say about this, except that they enact this. But in terms of the pragmatic reality of it, there's an actual real issue, which is that if these companies decide for ideological reasons or for profitable reasons that it's important to ban a particular perspective, then in practice the public does not get to hear that perspective. We're currently running into that in terms of the fact that a lot of people are bringing up questions that seem like they're worth answering in terms of, wait, why this degree of incompetence about the pandemic? But even asking that question tends to cause these people to get lumped with the QAnon cluster, branded as dangerous and banned. That's a problem. Even if they turn out to be wrong, there's a systematic issue having to do with casting entire perspectives and voices into the collective Jungian shadow. This is not healthy. It cannot be healthy. Then there's an honest question of what does that mean we do about it? I think that it's complicated. I don't claim to have a solution. But the reason I want to put that forward is because like it's important to be able to ask the question. And one of the problems we're running into is a whole lot of people coming forward insisting that they have the answer. Like one of the common ones I keep seeing is, Twitter was right to ban Trump. And they have a right to because they are a private platform. Which, A, completely ignores the question. How is this structure interfacing with our capacity as a society to have conversations that allow voices to be heard and digested in a way that creates kindness for everybody? In a way that avoids the accumulation of power in the name of essentially self-interest in ways that damage our collective resources. That's not being addressed at all. And second, this assertion that, well, the laws say this about like Twitter being a private company, and therefore they are right. Like, no. Like that's in the rationalist community, we'd say that is a failure of the is-ought distinction. You're describing what is and then saying that's what ought to be because it is. Like, and then I have all these things of there's no need for should, which complicates the whole thing. But the thing that I actually want to highlight about that, like, independent of the question of whether you, my dear viewer, agree with my perspective about the content of this issue with Twitter banning Trump, I'm grabbing this as yet another example of a phenomenon of engagement where the assertion, no, Twitter was right to do this. Trump is bad and they have a right to. The purpose of those words isn't to engage in the actual question of what's going on. it's not engaging with the problem at all. The purpose of that is to push forward a particular perspective. Right? Many people who are doing that are doing it in a kind of, in a sort of autopilot form. They're just sort of spewing out these thoughts and ideas. They're not even their own. They're just, it's like their mouths are plugged up to, their mouths are plugged directly into their ears, loosely speaking. Like there's a bit of a delay so that they can repeat things later that they've heard earlier, but there's something like that going on, where the mechanism goes through the body. The mechanism goes through the, no, I really believe this. Oh, why do you believe it? Because I've heard it a lot. Good luck with that. Do you suppose there might be a problem with this method of learning? So, excuse me. So, the thing that I really want to zoom in on and highlight, I've mentioned this a couple of times in this video, I really want to zoom in. It gets even harder. Like this glee for things going badly, this glee about, oh, look, Trump got banned. So why so much investment? Because he's the devil. So this is why I emphasize this thing that Ronnie is going, I feel a little triggered about. Pay attention to the energy, not the content. The content is a function of the energy. What people say and what arguments they choose to make derives from their motives, from the energy that arises in them. This is true across the board. Our cultural unfamiliarity with this, frankly, really obvious point. Once you see it, once you recognize it, this is immensely obvious, absolutely crystal clear. But our cultural unfamiliarity with it is part of why we're in this mess. We keep believing that we have to somehow make the effects in our world take a certain shape, but we don't have control over the effects. We only have control over a certain aspect of the causes. And that certain aspect for each one of us is inside ourselves. So the reason all of this chaos is appearing, and I'm zooming out tremendously, and I'm going here, I'm going to make this blanket claim. This blanket claim, I claim, if you pay attention to the mechanisms in yourself and you learn how this law works, like this law that causes cause effects, like it really feels that obvious once you see it. It's like, oh, right, the feeling of my life is a reflection of the energies that habitually arise in me. I don't necessarily control things like, is it raining outside? But I absolutely have control over how I relate to the rain and whether I'm in a place that rains a lot. And that control comes from not from the level of action. Because if you try to act on the level of action, it's too far down the causal chain. The place of actual influence that can matter is at the level of what energies arise. And in particular, how do I get hooked? How do I get sucked in? So when we, so my sweeping claim, I see Jadu makes a comment, I'll jump in on that in a second. So this sweeping, the sweeping claim I want to make is the reason 2020 happened the way it did, the reason we have global inequity, the reason that we're dealing with climate change, the reason we have all of these problems showing up over and over and over again, and the whole thing seems to be accelerating, is because we are leaning into trying to make things different out here without addressing the hooks inside. So the specific hook that I wanted to point out in this video, this particular hook that I think is extremely general, just shows up over and over again. It gets even harder. Like this flare of drama, this, did you hear what Trump said? Or on the other side, did you see they banned Parler? They banned all of these things. They're silencing people. This is awful. What got you? What just controlled your energy? Answering that question matters far more than anything on the object level of dealing with who's banning whom, who is allowed to say what, etc. We can't answer those questions until we address our own internal, each one of us, our own addiction to drama. So otherwise, if we really like the flair of drama, guess what we're going to create around us? Maybe not consciously intending, but that little bit about, like in interacting with my partner, there's these parts of me, like we're sorting out stuff in our relationship about, oh, there's this whole layer where we haven't been honest with ourselves and with each other about what our connection even means. Let's excavate this. And there are all these temptations for me to bring in blame, or for me to go, oh, I really screwed up here. And what's that for? Isn't it exciting? So until I can admit to myself that I have that draw, to feel it fully, and to decide that I would rather have truth than drama. Until I make that choice inside myself and do that process of opening up, letting go, taking a deep breath, prioritizing paying attention to where and when I am hooked. Until I make that choice, I can't actually change anything in my life. And once I do, change is inevitable. I say this both from theory and from a lot of personal experience. So, let's see, we have some comments going on here. So Jadu says, the emotional brain is a subcommittee in how content is created and traded. It depends on what you mean by the emotional brain. You may be cutting the structure of the subjective experience into different pieces than I am. I would say that the emotional brain would include the part that's going, how dare you have said that? And I think that part is part of the output of the energetic hook that I'm talking about. That's in Enneagram studies, which is an offshoot of a particular thread of Western mysticism that sort of went through Sufism. There's a distinction made between emotions and feelings. So I'd want to say something like our sense organs around feelings is not only a subcommittee, but it's like a defining force in how content is created and traded. Like what I accept from others, what I choose to do with it, what I choose to repeat, what I choose to create and display, what I choose to practice in my own mind. Those choices, like the mind is actually a very passive machine. When I say the mind, I'm talking about the thing that generates thoughts and has thoughts being said, especially the talky part. If you're familiar with Ian McGilchrist's model, when I say mind, I'm approximately meaning the left hemisphere. So the mind is an immensely passive machine. It's like a steam engine without the steam. It has an input for the steam, but it's like a whole bunch of input valves. Like you can take a pipe and plug it into different parts of the mind, and then it'll rev different thought chains. And some of that revving will include going down and getting a hold of another pipe and plugging it into part of the mind. But it's very mechanistic. It's very passive. So the thing is that the mind is responding to, in this place the metaphor breaks down a bit, but what minds are for, in some sense, is calculating a way to aim at a particular kind of energetic result. You're dealing with, like, if I'm if I am really hurt by something that my partner says, and I believe that she meant it in a particular way, I mean, the belief is very secondary. Part of what's going on is I feel pain, and then there's this sense of if I blame, if I come up with a blaming thing, then I can distance myself from the pain. So then the blame energy hits my mind, and my mind finds out how to blame her. The content may include a bunch of thoughts and logic. The content may include a bunch of emotions. I realize I made a distinction between emotions and feeling, and I didn't distinguish, but I'm basically defining the difference. Like the feeling is sort of a field. It's a sensory experience. The emotion is sort of the output of the entanglement with thought. So I may have a bunch of anger that appears. I may have a whole bunch of like logic and arguments and refusal to listen, and like there's a whole bunch of stuff that can come out of that. But importantly, if she were to engage with those emotions or to engage with the logic, it wouldn't change the result, because the purpose of the mind is to find a way to enact the blame energy. So what I mean is, so I want to make a distinction between the emotional brain that is the part of the mind that can output emotion versus the hooks that happen much lower. And I keep touching my belly. I realize you can't even see where I'm touching on my belly. It's like I experience it often. The hooks is almost like in the navel around the belly button. I don't know how universal that is, but that's the level that I'm talking about. And then I would say it's much more than a subcommittee. I would say that what we end up doing in the long run is always defined by the energetic tone that arises, the feeling. Okay. Maybe not in the short term, because the mind has been engineered in a bunch of different ways, a bunch of mimetic infections and adjustments that need to be adjusted in dialogue with reality. But the net effect is always going to be that we create the life experience that we have based on the energy that arises from down below. This is like, once you see this, is like like the energetic engineer's non-BS version of the law of attraction. It's like, if you punch people, then you will be surrounded by people who have been punched and people who, and not by any people who know how to avoid being punched. It's very mechanical. You only hang around people who will tolerate being punched. Law of attraction? Kind of. It's very mechanical once you see how it works. Okay, so let's see. David mentions for later. Cool. Great, I'll trust that that's for later then. Heron Stone, hello. I don't think I've seen you post here before in one of these lives. Nice to meet you indirectly. The language machine. Yeah, I mean, imagine you're referring to when I was describing the mind and referencing, yeah, well, in Ian McGilchrist's model, it's basically the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere, importantly, is the only part of the brain that is, well, it's the hemisphere that is capable of outputting speech. That's Broca's area. But it doesn't have a monopoly on understanding speech or writing. And importantly, the right hemisphere is actually better at understanding language than the left hemisphere, because the right hemisphere is responsible for understanding metaphor and context. The left hemisphere understands language the way a computer understands language. So so if you track the talking part of your thoughts, where you're thinking in words, guaranteed that's left hemisphere. So it had to pump through Broca's area to produce the words in your own mind. But understanding language and like listening, and even things like poetry or literature, and taking in that impact and then digesting that impact, that's not necessarily the left hemisphere. But if you take that and you start doing wordplay with it, yeah. So definitely the language machine. Yeah. See, Jadu has two comments here. I'll just see them both here. So yes, likewise, quote unquote parts are more or less conscious or not. The structural dissociation model has been a game changer in my understanding and use of mindfulness in psychotherapy. I assume structural dissociation is sort of like internal family systems. Um, so yeah, I think that that can be very helpful. Models like that are great. Fun fact, by the way, when I described internal family systems to my father, he said, "Oh, that's Gestalt therapy." My father is a mental health counselor. He's a master's degree in counseling psychology. I just grew up listening to a lot of these ideas. Um, and he tends to be rooted in the kinds of material and theories that were happening around the 60s, 70s. Um, I've never dug into this, but I believe him. He tends to be right about this kind of thing of, oh, well, the logic of internal family systems seems to be exactly the same as Gestalt therapy by Fritz Perls. JD also says, agreed, subcommittee, not a great choice of words, maybe only when observed. Cool. Cool. And Heron replies, a whole brain together. Yeah, language is definitely a whole brain phenomenon. Definitely a whole brain phenomenon. Language output that can matter. Definitely whole integrated brain. Definitely strongly needed there. Cool. So I feel like I have said my piece. Mostly just wanting to highlight awareness of this hookness. Right? Like noticing that it's alive in me. It's clearly alive in others. It gets even harder. And I want to emphasize, by the way, when I'm saying that, I don't mean to criticize my old professor. I think that that's it's like it's a fantastic form of humor, possibly very very beautifully used in that case. Um, the thing that I want to highlight is the enjoyment of the bad. The way that when there is an addiction to that, when there's a demand for that kind of energy, and I think there's a really powerful reason for that in the westernized world, why we demand that kind of entertainment. If you oh, you know, I think this is hard to search for now. I wrote an article a while back about this. I called it The Great Gaslighting, but I wrote it for a group of people who practice psychological alchemy and think of themselves as witches and magic users. Which, like in practice, I think it's fair to say that I can go with them, but I can navigate a lot of different groups and feel like I belong. So this. But I say that in that there's a way of understanding. I wrote an article about understanding the arc of Western history that I think helps to clarify why it is that we have such a desperate, panicky hunger for meaning, but also a fear of it. Like both of those together has resulted in a pretty massive psychic scar in the westernized world, which is to say the world as interconnected. So there's a lot of reason for this addiction to drama, why there's a need for some kind of distraction. As far as I can tell, what we're running into right now is a global fact that we're basically out of room to ignore our own need to pay attention to our divorce from truth. That's at a collective level. This matters at an individual level, because at the individual level, there actually is something that you can do about it. Not a matter of activism, not a matter of should. It's a matter of recognizing a mechanical fact that for each one of us, if we prioritize unhooking the hooks, we can't be gotten. Things become a lot clearer. All of this is much less scary. I'm actually mostly not scared by what's going on. Like to the extent that I unhook myself, there's a sense of, yeah, it's scary. There's definitely stuff to track, but I'm not worried. Because I have a lot of trust in my relationship to reality and to truth. And there's also a connection to something like, the worst thing that happens is I die. Says the immortal, but like that would suck. I would prefer not that. But there's an ease, not a giving up, just a, oh, okay, well, here's truth, and I trust in truth, and I try to deepen my trust in truth. Since nothing can challenge the truth, if I plant my feet there, I'm stable. So there is a way to navigate all this a lot more easily than the world would have one believe. So I just wanted to offer that, suggest it's a path to freedom and to sanity. And that if enough people do that, we'd actually end up with a pretty awesome world. Yeah, I see Heron adds, don't believe everything you hear your language machine say. Yeah, its purpose for speaking is not always truth. It is not a wise thing. I'm reminded of, what's her name? Byron Katie, who says, you're only ever doing one of two things with a thought. You are believing it or you are challenging it. And she encourages challenging the thought. She came up with something called the work, which is a process of inquiry. So you can look her up. Like if you Google Byron Katie the work, you'll find her stuff. It's very simple. She has the core of her technique out in public for anybody to use. Okay, I think that wraps me up. Thanks for listening, and I plan on hopping on again tomorrow. Cheers.